Instead of opening a Christmas gift, my family handed me an invoice for $18,472, and every pair of eyes around the dinner table waited for me to apologize. I looked down at the thick, cream-colored envelope resting beside my dinner plate. My name, Margaret Collins, had been written across the front in elegant gold lettering, just like everyone else's. For one hopeful second, I thought perhaps my son had finally remembered how much I loved handwritten Christmas cards. I couldn't have been more wrong. I quietly folded the paper back into the envelope without saying a word. The silence around the table seemed to confuse everyone far more than tears would have. The next morning, I called the one man my late husband had trusted more than anyone else. But before I tell you what happened after that Christmas dinner, let me take you back to the moment everything I believed about my family changed forever. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and if you'd like, tell me which city you're watching from. Sometimes it comforts me to know this story has traveled farther than I ever imagined. For 69 Christmases, I believed family dinners were sacred. Not perfect, not free from disagreements, but sacred. The Collins family had gathered around holiday tables long before my husband, Richard, and I bought our colonial home outside Columbus, Ohio. After we married, we carried on every tradition ourselves. We hosted Thanksgiving. We decorated the tallest tree we could fit into the living room. We baked cinnamon rolls before sunrise on Christmas morning. Even after Richard passed away 3 years earlier, I refused to let those traditions disappear. Grief had already taken enough from me. I wasn't about to let it steal Christmas too. That December afternoon, snow drifted softly across the front yard while I carefully wrapped the last homemade loaf of cranberry walnut bread in red ribbon. My kitchen smelled of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh pine from the wreath hanging above the sink. I checked my reflection in the microwave door. Silver hair neatly curled. Green sweater Richard used to call my Christmas uniform. A pair of pearl earrings he had given me on our 40th anniversary. You still clean up pretty well, Margaret. I whispered to my own reflection before laughing quietly at myself. No one was there to hear it. At 5 o'clock sharp, I carried 2 casserole dishes across town to Ethan's house. He had insisted on hosting this year. Mom, you deserve to relax for once, he'd said over the phone. The words had warmed me more than he probably realized. When I pulled into the driveway, colorful lights covered every inch of the roof. Inflatable snowmen bounced gently in the wind while Christmas music drifted through the open front door. Inside, the house buzzed with laughter. My 14-year-old granddaughter, Chloe, ran over first. Grandma. She hugged me tightly enough to nearly knock the casserole from my hands. You made the sweet potatoes? I wouldn't dare show up without them. She grinned. I told Mom yours are better. Before she could say another word, Vanessa appeared from the dining room wearing an immaculate emerald dress and a smile polished enough to belong in a magazine advertisement. There you are, Margaret. Not Mom. Not Margaret with warmth. Just Margaret. I was beginning to think the roads kept you home. The roads are fine, I answered, handing her one of the dishes. They smell wonderful, she said, though she never lifted the lid to check. Ethan emerged moments later, kissed my cheek, and took my coat. Merry Christmas, Mom. Merry Christmas, sweetheart. He smiled, but something about it felt distracted, as though his mind had never quite arrived at dinner. I brushed the thought aside. People get tired during the holidays. The dining room looked beautiful. Candles flickered along the center of the oak table. Gold napkins rested beneath crystal glasses. Every place setting included a neatly folded envelope tied with a thin velvet ribbon. What's all this? I asked. Vanessa beamed. A little family tradition I thought we'd start. Opening gifts before dessert. She laughed. Oh, something like that. Dinner itself felt strangely ordinary. Too ordinary. Conversation drifted from football to holiday travel plans. Chloe talked excitedly about joining the school orchestra. Ethan discussed a new project at his engineering firm. Vanessa mostly listened, watching, occasionally catching Ethan's eye. Each time, he looked away first. Halfway through dessert, Vanessa gently tapped her wine glass with a spoon. I thought we'd do something special before presents. Everyone turned toward her. She reached beneath the table and picked up a stack of matching envelopes. I've prepared something for each member of the family. She walked around distributing them one by one. Smiles spread across the table. People thanked her. Some joked about guessing what was inside. Finally, she stopped beside me. For you, Margaret. Her smile never wavered. I untied the ribbon. Inside wasn't a Christmas card. It wasn't a photograph. It wasn't a gift certificate. It was an itemized invoice. Across the top, printed in bold black letters, were the words, "Outstanding family expenses." Below that, line after line. Babysitting assistance, holiday meal contributions, transportation, utilities during overnight visits, groceries, 5 years' worth of carefully calculated charges. Every family visit, every holiday, every favor, every shared meal, everything had been assigned a dollar amount. At the bottom sat the final figure. Balance due, $18 for 72.00. For a moment, I honestly wondered whether someone had made a terrible mistake. I looked up. No one laughed. No one said, "Just kidding." Vanessa folded her hands calmly on the table. We thought Christmas would be the perfect time to settle accounts. A couple of distant relatives chuckled awkwardly. My eyes moved to Ethan. He stared at his plate. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Vanessa reached beside her chair and calmly placed a small portable credit card reader on the table. "It accepts all major cards," she said pleasantly. "Or a check is perfectly fine." The room became so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I picked up the invoice again, reading every line carefully. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Who made this list?" Vanessa's smile hesitated for the first time. She glanced toward Ethan. He still wouldn't look at me. No one answered. As I folded the invoice closed, one final line caught my eye in tiny print near the bottom of the page. "Interest begins January 1 SD." I slipped the paper back into its envelope and smiled. How interesting. I expected someone to laugh. Someone to say it had all been a ridiculous Christmas prank. Instead, Vanessa calmly took another sip of her wine, as though handing your mother-in-law a bill for nearly $19,000 was as ordinary as passing the mashed potatoes. No one corrected her. No one looked surprised. Only embarrassed. That hurt even more. I carefully folded the invoice along its original crease and slipped it back into the envelope. My hands didn't shake. Years of raising children, managing a household, and sitting beside my husband through chemotherapy had taught me that panic rarely improved any situation. "What exactly am I looking at?" I asked quietly. Vanessa answered before Ethan had the chance. "A record." "A record of what?" "Expenses." Her voice remained polite. "Measured. As a family, we've absorbed a lot of costs over the years. We just thought it was time to make everything fair." Fair. The word lingered in my mind like smoke. I looked back at the first page. Holiday hosting, gas money, electricity, babysitting, laundry, even coffee. Someone had assigned a dollar amount to every moment I had believed was simply called family. "I didn't realize Christmas had become tax season," I said. A nervous laugh escaped from Ethan's younger cousin across the table before he quickly looked down at his plate. Vanessa didn't smile. "I'm serious, Margaret. I can see that." She leaned forward slightly. "You've stayed overnight here dozens of times. When Chloe asked me to. You've eaten meals. With my family. You've used utilities." I blinked. "I breathed your air too. Did you charge me for that?" This time, no one laughed. Even Vanessa's smile stiffened. Ethan finally cleared his throat. "Mom." I turned toward him. He still couldn't meet my eyes. "Did you know about this?" He hesitated for several seconds. Vanessa answered for him. "We discussed it. Not we created it." "Not we." Agreed. "We discussed it." The difference mattered. It told me Ethan hadn't been leading this conversation, but neither had he stopped it. I nodded slowly. "I understand." Whether I truly understood or not hardly mattered anymore. Across the table, Chloe quietly stared between her parents and me. Her fork rested untouched beside her dessert plate. She looked confused, not amused. That small detail became the only comfort I found all evening. Vanessa reached into her purse and produced a small wireless payment terminal. She set it gently beside my plate. "I brought this to make things easier." I stared at the little machine. It looked absurd sitting among Christmas candles and crystal glasses. A receipt printer beside cranberry sauce. Technology designed for grocery stores now resting next to my homemade pecan pie. Richard would have shaken his head in disbelief. "I accept checks too," Vanessa added. Still calm. Still smiling. Almost as though she genuinely believed she was being reasonable. I looked toward Ethan one last time. He rubbed both hands together beneath the table. His wedding ring caught the candlelight. He looked exhausted. Not angry. Ashamed. But shame without action is a quiet kind of permission. Finally, I spoke. Who actually calculated all of this? Silence. Vanessa glanced sideways. Not at me. At Ethan. He looked away again. I asked a question. Another pause. Then Vanessa answered. I kept records. You? Yes. For 5 years. I like staying organized. Organized. That was one way to describe recording every dinner your husband's mother ever shared with your family. I lowered my eyes to the final page again. There were dates. Specific dates. Christmases. Birthdays. School concerts. One entry stopped me. March 18th. 3 years earlier. Transportation assistance. $48. My chest tightened. That date wasn't random. It was the day after Richard's funeral. Ethan had insisted I stay overnight because I was too exhausted to drive home. I remembered Chloe sleeping beside me because she didn't want Grandma to cry alone. The next morning, Vanessa had made pancakes. She hugged me before I left. I'd thanked her for taking such good care of me. Now I was apparently being billed for gasoline and breakfast. The room suddenly felt colder. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the dining room windows. Inside, every Christmas decoration seemed strangely artificial. The glowing tree, the stockings, the cheerful music drifting faintly from the living room. Everything looked festive. Nothing felt warm. I'm impressed, I said quietly. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. By what? The bookkeeping. For the first time all evening, she smiled with genuine satisfaction. I've always believed good records prevent misunderstandings. I folded the invoice once more. As I did, something printed near the bottom caught my attention. Tiny letters. Easy to miss. Interest begins January 1st. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Interest. They hadn't simply wanted repayment. They intended to profit from it. I slipped the envelope into my handbag. I'll keep this. Of course, Vanessa replied. I'll need time to review it. That's perfectly reasonable. She sounded almost relieved. Perhaps she expected shouting. Or tears. Instead, I stood slowly and reached for my coat. So soon? Ethan asked. I think it's best. I can drive you. No. I smiled gently. I've driven myself for nearly 50 years. I believe I can manage one more trip. Chloe hurried after me into the front hallway while the others remained in the dining room. Grandma. I turned. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. For what, sweetheart? I didn't know. I believed her immediately. Children rarely fake confusion that well. I kissed her forehead. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. She hugged me tightly. Longer than usual. As I stepped onto the porch, cold December air filled my lungs. The snow had covered the driveway in a fresh blanket of white. Behind me, laughter slowly returned inside the house. Someone had turned the Christmas music up louder, as if nothing unusual had happened. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and placed the envelope carefully on the passenger side. For several moments, I simply stared at it. A Christmas card would have been easier to understand. Even coal in a stocking would have made more sense. But an invoice? Someone had spent years quietly assigning prices to love. As I started the engine, my phone vibrated. One new text message. The sender's name made me stop breathing for a moment. Oliver Brooks, Richard's former accountant. The message contained only 4 words. Don't leave town yet. The drive home felt much longer than 25 minutes. Snow collected steadily on the windshield as my wipers swept back and forth in a slow rhythm that matched my thoughts. The envelope sat untouched on the passenger seat, as though opening it again would somehow make the numbers more real. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the porch light illuminated the empty front yard Richard had always insisted on decorating himself. 3 years had passed since his death, yet every Christmas I still expected to see him standing on the ladder, arguing that one more string of lights would make the house look like it belonged in a Hallmark movie. I smiled at the memory before unlocking my front door. The silence inside greeted me immediately. It was a different kind of silence than the one I'd left behind at Ethan's house. There, silence had been uncomfortable because people refused to speak. Here, silence simply meant I was alone. I hung my coat carefully, placed my purse on the kitchen counter, and brewed a cup of chamomile tea. Old habits survived even the worst evenings. While the kettle heated, my phone buzzed again. Oliver Brooks, Richard's accountant for nearly 30 years. We hadn't spoken much since the estate was settled, but every Christmas he still mailed a handwritten card. I opened his message. Please call me tomorrow morning before making any decisions. No explanation. Just that. I considered calling immediately but decided against it. If Oliver believed it could wait until morning, then perhaps I should allow myself one quiet night first. I carried my tea into the living room and finally opened the envelope again. This time I examined every page carefully. The invoice was astonishingly detailed. Each entry included dates, descriptions, estimated costs, and handwritten notes in neat blue ink. Grandmother overnight visit. Increased utilities. Transportation to school recital. Holiday meal contribution. Weekend babysitting requested by Chloe. My eyes stopped at that last line. Requested by Chloe. I remembered that weekend perfectly. Ethan and Vanessa had flown to Chicago for a conference after their babysitter canceled. Chloe had cried on the phone because she wanted to stay with Grandma instead of another stranger. We'd baked cookies, watched old Christmas movies even though it was July, and spent hours assembling a 1,000-piece puzzle on my dining room table. It had never occurred to me that someone was quietly calculating the electric bill while we laughed together. I closed my eyes. Every memory now seemed to carry a second shadow I had never noticed before. Around midnight, I finally went upstairs, but sleep refused to come. Instead, old memories surfaced one after another. Ethan at 6 years old with scraped knees after falling off his bicycle. Ethan at 16 asking me to work extra shifts so he could attend a science camp in Michigan. Ethan graduating from Ohio State with tears in his eyes because Richard and I had somehow managed to pay every tuition bill without him taking on crushing debt. Richard and I had never kept score. Parents weren't supposed to. Sometime after dawn, I gave up trying to sleep and headed downstairs. While making coffee, I glanced toward the refrigerator where dozens of magnets held photographs collected over decades. There was Chloe at age 5 wearing a flower-covered apron. Ethan holding the keys to his first car. Richard standing beside the oak tree we planted when Ethan was born. I noticed something I'd never paid much attention to before. Nearly every photograph had been taken here, at this house. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, Easter egg hunts, cookouts, countless ordinary Saturdays. My home had been the center of the family for decades. The thought made last night's invoice feel even stranger. Shortly after 9 o'clock, my phone rang. Oliver. Good morning, Margaret. I wish I could say it was. His voice softened. I had a feeling. How? There was a pause. Richard asked me to watch over certain things if they ever became necessary. My grip tightened around the coffee mug. Necessary for what? I'd rather explain in person. Oliver, my daughter-in-law, handed me a bill for nearly $19,000 on Christmas Eve. He sighed quietly, as though the sentence confirmed something he had hoped would never happen. Did Ethan stop her? I looked out the kitchen window toward the snow-covered backyard. No. Another long silence followed. Can you meet me this afternoon? He finally asked. There's something Richard left with me years ago. My heartbeat quickened. His will was settled. This isn't about the will. Then what is it? Something he instructed me to keep private unless you ever began questioning your place in the family. I leaned against the kitchen counter, suddenly unsteady. Richard had always noticed things before anyone else did. Tiny changes in people's expressions. Awkward conversations that everyone else overlooked. Had he seen something before he died? Where should we meet? I asked. My office. 2 o'clock. Before hanging up, Oliver added one more sentence. Margaret, whatever you do, don't throw that invoice away. Bring every page with you. As the call ended, I looked once more at the envelope resting on the kitchen table. For the first time since Christmas dinner, I wasn't looking at it as a demand for money. I was beginning to wonder if it might become evidence of something far larger than a cruel holiday surprise. Oliver Brooks' office occupied the second floor of an old brick building overlooking the courthouse square in downtown Columbus. Richard used to joke that Oliver refused to move because the building was older than both of them and just as stubborn. As I climbed the narrow wooden staircase that afternoon, I caught myself expecting Richard to be waiting at the top, carrying 2 coffees and teasing me for arriving exactly 5 minutes early. Instead, Oliver stood alone in the doorway, his gray suit as perfectly pressed as ever. Merry Christmas, Margaret, he said softly. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. So do I. He invited me inside without another word. His office looked almost exactly as I remembered it from years before. Shelves, lined with leather-bound tax books, framed photographs of fishing trips with Richard, a grandfather clock ticking quietly in the corner, and an enormous oak desk polished to a warm shine. He waited until I sat before speaking again. Did you bring the invoice? I slid the cream-colored envelope across the desk. Oliver opened it carefully, reading each page in complete silence. Occasionally he adjusted his glasses, but his expression never changed. When he reached the final page, he let out a slow breath. I hoped I'd never see this. You knew something like this might happen? He looked directly at me. Richard did. The room suddenly felt much smaller. What do you mean? Oliver stood and walked toward a tall filing cabinet against the back wall. From the bottom drawer he removed a locked black document case. Its brass clasp showed years of careful use. He carried it back to the desk and rested one hand on top without opening it immediately. About 8 months before Richard passed away, he asked me to prepare several documents that were never included in his estate. I frowned. Why wouldn't he include them? Because he hoped they would never be needed. Oliver unlocked the case. Inside rested several neatly organized folders, each labeled in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. My chest tightened the moment I recognized the familiar slant of every letter. Richard's handwriting had once filled grocery lists, birthday cards, and little notes he tucked beside my coffee cup before leaving for work. Seeing it again after 3 years felt strangely like hearing his voice. Oliver selected a thick navy folder labeled simply Family Ledger. What's that? I asked. A record. I almost laughed at the painful coincidence. Another record? A very different one. He opened the folder and carefully turned it toward me. The first page contained columns of dates stretching back nearly 20 years. Beneath each date appeared payments, transfers, loan agreements, tuition checks, mortgage assistance, medical bills, insurance premiums, and handwritten notes explaining why each expense had been made. Richard kept this? I whispered. Oliver nodded. Every major financial decision involving the family. I stared at page after page in disbelief. Ethan's college tuition, the down payment for Ethan and Vanessa's first home, their wedding expenses, repairs after a basement flood, medical deductibles when Chloe broke her arm skiing, even several months of mortgage payments during the recession when Ethan had briefly lost his job. Every check number, every bank statement, every receipt, every signature. Nothing had been forgotten. I had no idea, I admitted quietly. Oliver gave a small smile. You weren't supposed to. Richard believed generosity only counted if it wasn't used to make someone feel indebted. I slowly turned another page. The totals continued growing. $50,000. $120,000. Nearly $300,000. My hands became still. This can't be right. It is. Richard never talked about any of this. Because he loved your son. Oliver folded his hands together. He never wanted Ethan to feel like his success belonged to anyone else. Tears blurred my vision, but I blinked them away before they could fall. Richard had protected Ethan's dignity every step of the way. In return, someone had calculated the price of my coffee. Oliver reached into the case again and removed several transparent sleeves containing canceled checks and signed documents. Everything is supported by evidence. I glanced from one receipt to another. Richard had anticipated questions that might never come. Why are you showing me this now? Oliver looked at the Christmas invoice lying beside the ledger. Because this changed everything. He tapped Vanessa's invoice with one finger. Your husband gave freely. This document treats generosity like a business transaction. Richard feared that if anyone in the family ever started measuring love in dollars, they'd eventually forget where those dollars came from. I remained silent. His words settled heavily between us. Oliver opened another section of the ledger. Tucked inside was a sealed white envelope with my name written across the front. The handwriting was unmistakably Richard's. I reached toward it instinctively before stopping. Should I open it? Oliver gently shook his head. Not yet. Why? Because Richard left very specific instructions. My heart began beating faster. Instructions? Oliver nodded once. He told me this envelope should only be opened after you had seen everything else. He slid another folder from beneath the ledger. Unlike the others, it contained no writing except 2 carefully printed words on the tab. Christmas only. Oliver rested his hand on it, but didn't open it. Margaret, he said quietly, before we look inside this folder, there's something you need to understand about the promise your husband asked me to keep. Oliver Brooks' office occupied the second floor of an old brick building overlooking the courthouse square in downtown Columbus. Richard used to joke that Oliver refused to move because the building was older than both of them and just as stubborn. As I climbed the narrow wooden staircase that afternoon, I caught myself expecting Richard to be waiting at the top, carrying 2 coffees and teasing me for arriving exactly 5 minutes early. Instead, Oliver stood alone in the doorway, his gray suit as perfectly pressed as ever. "Merry Christmas, Margaret," he said softly. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "So do I." He invited me inside without another word. His office looked almost exactly as I remembered it from years before. Shelves lined with leather-bound tax books, framed photographs of fishing trips with Richard, a grandfather clock ticking quietly in the corner, and an enormous oak desk polished to a warm shine. He waited until I sat before speaking again. "Did you bring the invoice?" I slid the cream-colored envelope across the desk. Oliver opened it carefully, reading each page in complete silence. Occasionally he adjusted his glasses, but his expression never changed. When he reached the final page, he let out a slow breath. "I hoped I'd never see this. You knew something like this might happen?" He looked directly at me. Richard did. The room suddenly felt much smaller. "What do you mean?" Oliver stood and walked toward a tall filing cabinet against the back wall. From the bottom drawer he removed a locked black document case. Its brass clasp showed years of careful use. He carried it back to the desk and rested one hand on top without opening it immediately. About 8 months before Richard passed away, he asked me to prepare several documents that were never included in his estate. I frowned. Why wouldn't he include them? Because he hoped they would never be needed. Oliver unlocked the case. Inside rested several neatly organized folders, each labeled in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. My chest tightened the moment I recognized the familiar slant of every letter. Richard's handwriting had once filled grocery lists, birthday cards, and little notes he tucked beside my coffee cup before leaving for work. Seeing it again after 3 years felt strangely like hearing his voice. Oliver selected a thick navy folder labeled simply Family Ledger. "What's that?" I asked. "A record." I almost laughed at the painful coincidence. "Another record?" "A very different one." He opened the folder and carefully turned it toward me. The first page contained columns of dates stretching back nearly 20 years. Beneath each date appeared payments, transfers, loan agreements, tuition checks, mortgage assistance, medical bills, insurance premiums, and handwritten notes explaining why each expense had been made. "Richard kept this?" I whispered. Oliver nodded. "Every major financial decision involving the family." I stared at page after page in disbelief. Ethan's college tuition, the down payment for Ethan and Vanessa's first home, their wedding expenses, repairs after a basement flood, medical deductibles when Chloe broke her arm skiing, even several months of mortgage payments during the recession when Ethan had briefly lost his job. Every check number, every bank statement, every receipt, every signature. Nothing had been forgotten. I had no idea, I admitted quietly. Oliver gave a small smile. "You weren't supposed to." Richard believed generosity only counted if it wasn't used to make someone feel indebted. I slowly turned another page. The totals continued growing. $50,000, $120,000, nearly $300,000. My hands became still. This can't be right. It is. Richard never talked about any of this. Because he loved your son. Oliver folded his hands together. He never wanted Ethan to feel like his success belonged to anyone else. Tears blurred my vision, but I blinked them away before they could fall. Richard had protected Ethan's dignity every step of the way. In return, someone had calculated the price of my coffee. Oliver reached into the case again and removed several transparent sleeves containing canceled checks and signed documents. Everything is supported by evidence. I glanced from one receipt to another. Richard had anticipated questions that might never come. "Why are you showing me this now?" Oliver looked at the Christmas invoice lying beside the ledger. "Because this changed everything." He tapped Vanessa's invoice with one finger. "Your husband gave freely. This document treats generosity like a business transaction." Richard feared that if anyone in the family ever started measuring love in dollars, they'd eventually forget where those dollars came from. I remained silent. His words settled heavily between us. Oliver opened another section of the ledger. Tucked inside was a sealed white envelope with my name written across the front. The handwriting was unmistakably Richard's. I reached toward it instinctively before stopping. Should I open it? Oliver gently shook his head. Not yet. Why? Because Richard left very specific instructions. My heart began beating faster. Instructions? Oliver nodded once. He told me this envelope should only be opened after you had seen everything else. He slid another folder from beneath the ledger. Unlike the others, it contained no writing except 2 carefully printed words on the tab. Christmas only. Oliver rested his hand on it, but didn't open it. Margaret, he said quietly, before we look inside this folder, there's something you need to understand about the promise your husband asked me to keep. I looked at Oliver for several long seconds before answering. I don't know if anyone is ever prepared for something like this. He gave a small nod, as though that was the only honest answer he expected. Then he released the flash drive into my hand. It felt surprisingly ordinary, no different from dozens of others I had used over the years to store family photographs or tax documents. Yet Richard had apparently trusted this tiny device to carry something important enough to remain hidden until now. Oliver gestured toward the computer on the corner of his desk. Whenever you're ready. I inserted the flash drive and waited while the screen displayed a single folder. Inside was one video file and several scanned legal documents. Oliver pointed toward the video. Richard specifically instructed that you watch this before reading anything else. I clicked play. The screen faded from black to Richard sitting in our old sunroom. Judging by the flowers blooming outside the windows, it had been filmed during late spring, only a few months before his diagnosis became terminal. He looked healthy, relaxed, and wore the same blue sweater Chloe had always teased him about because she claimed it made him look like a television weatherman. Seeing him smile again stole the air from my lungs. "Hello, sweetheart," he began. His voice sounded exactly as I remembered. Calm, warm, steady. If you're watching this, then something happened that I prayed never would. I instinctively reached toward the screen before stopping myself. Richard continued. First, I need you to know something. None of what you're about to learn changes how much I loved our son. Ethan has a good heart. But good hearts sometimes become quiet when they should speak. And silence can do as much damage as cruelty. Tears blurred my vision. Richard had found the words I hadn't been able to say even to myself. He wasn't condemning Ethan. He was acknowledging his weakness. Richard leaned slightly closer to the camera. Margaret, if someone has turned ordinary family love into a financial transaction, if you've been handed a bill for kindness, meals, rides, holidays, or simply being a mother, then the issue is no longer money. It's values. And values are exactly what I wanted to protect after I was gone. I glanced toward Oliver. He remained silent, allowing Richard's words to fill the room. The video continued. For decades, we helped our family because we wanted them to build happy lives, not because we expected repayment. Every tuition check, every emergency loan, every mortgage payment came from love. Love keeps no ledger. Greed always does. I remembered Vanessa's invoice resting on Oliver's desk only a few feet away. Suddenly, it looked painfully small compared to everything Richard had quietly given without ever asking for recognition. Richard smiled gently, the same reassuring smile that had carried me through every difficult season of our marriage. If this recording is playing, then Oliver has already shown you the family ledger. Don't let those numbers make you angry. They were never meant to embarrass anyone. They're simply the truth. Facts matter because memories become fragile when people begin rewriting history. He paused before continuing. There's one more thing you need to understand. Years ago, I instructed our attorney to create an amendment to the Collins Family Trust. It remains inactive unless one condition is met. That condition isn't someone's opinion. It isn't suspicion. It requires evidence. I slowly looked down at Vanessa's invoice. Richard almost seemed to anticipate my reaction. Evidence, he repeated, that someone has attempted to treat your role as wife, mother, or grandmother as a debt to be collected rather than a relationship to be honored. The room fell completely silent except for Richard's recorded voice. If that evidence exists, then Oliver already knows what to do. I won't explain the legal details because they aren't important right now. What's important is this: I never wanted revenge. I wanted accountability. There is a difference. My tears finally escaped despite every attempt to hold them back. Richard wasn't speaking with bitterness. He sounded almost peaceful. Promise me something, Margaret, he said softly. Don't let this harden your heart. Justice without hatred is still possible. Give people every opportunity to choose honesty before consequences. Choose them instead. The video ended with Richard smiling directly into the camera. And if Chloe is standing beside you while you're watching this someday, tell her grandpa always believed she'd become the wisest Collins of us all. The screen went black. Neither Oliver nor I spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Oliver reached toward the keyboard and opened the remaining documents from the flash drive. The first was the trust amendment Richard had mentioned. I expected complicated legal language, but one section had been highlighted in yellow. Beneath the highlighted paragraph sat Richard's signature, the attorney's signature, and Oliver's witness certification. Oliver quietly explained, "The amendment doesn't punish anyone automatically. It temporarily suspends future discretionary distributions from the family trust until an independent review determines whether a beneficiary acted in bad faith toward you." I looked at him in surprise. So no one immediately loses anything? Correct. Richard refused to create a document based on anger. He created one based on conduct. Oliver closed the document and gently slid Vanessa's invoice beside it. "Margaret," he said, "this invoice may be the first piece of evidence the review board has ever needed. But before we move forward, there's one thing you deserve to know." He opened another scanned file containing dozens of recent financial summaries, then quietly added, "Over the past 2 years, Ethan and Vanessa have made several financial decisions they assumed no one would ever connect to the generosity your husband spent a lifetime quietly providing." For several minutes, Oliver and I studied the financial summaries in complete silence. The reports weren't accusations. They were simply records, bank statements, mortgage filings, trust distributions, and property documents collected over several years. Oliver pointed to a timeline he had prepared. "Richard asked me to continue monitoring the trust after his death, not because he expected the family to fail, but because he believed transparency prevented resentment." I nodded slowly. "What did you find?" Oliver slid one document closer. "Nothing illegal, but there are patterns." The first report showed that 6 months after Richard passed away, Ethan and Vanessa refinanced their mortgage using equity that had only been possible because Richard had paid their original down payment years earlier. Another report detailed renovations to their home, followed by the purchase of a vacation property in northern Michigan. "I don't understand," I admitted. "They've done well financially. Why would they ever think I owed them money?" Oliver sighed. "Sometimes people gradually stop seeing generosity as a gift. Eventually, they begin viewing it as an obligation that should continue forever. When that expectation changes, gratitude quietly disappears." His explanation hurt because it felt painfully believable. I remembered dozens of occasions when Ethan had apologized for accepting help. Richard would always smile and answer the same way. "Someday you'll help someone else." That's how families work. Apparently, somewhere along the way, that lesson had been forgotten. Oliver opened another folder. "There's something else." Inside were copies of emails exchanged between Ethan and the family's financial advisor concerning long-term retirement planning. None of them mentioned me directly until one message written by Vanessa caught my attention. "If Margaret eventually decides to sell her house, Ethan and I assume those proceeds won't affect future trust calculations." I stared at the sentence. There was nothing openly cruel about it. Yet reading my home reduced to a future financial variable left me strangely empty. Oliver quietly observed my reaction. Richard worried conversations like these would become more frequent after he was gone. Did Ethan write anything similar? Oliver shook his head. No. Most of his messages focused on investment questions. Vanessa handled nearly all discussions involving estate planning. I wanted that distinction to comfort me, but it didn't erase Ethan's silence at Christmas dinner. Remaining passive while someone humiliates another person still leaves a wound. Oliver closed the folder and leaned back. "The trust amendment requires one final step before anything moves forward." "What step?" "A family meeting." I looked up in surprise. "With everyone? Anyone directly affected? Including Vanessa?" "Especially Vanessa." I hesitated. Richard wanted that. Oliver nodded. Very specifically, he believed people deserve the opportunity to explain themselves before legal consequences begin. I smiled sadly. That sounds exactly like him. Richard had always believed difficult conversations should happen face to face, never through lawyers unless absolutely necessary. Oliver reached into his desk drawer and removed several sealed envelopes. These contain copies of the relevant trust documents. They'll only be distributed during the meeting. I looked at the envelopes. each bearing a printed name. Ethan Collins, Vanessa Collins, Margaret Collins. Oliver Brooks retained the final copy for himself. When? I asked. The first business day after New Year's. At your office? No. He smiled faintly. Richard insisted on the conference room at Harrison and Cole. Neutral ground. I couldn't help laughing softly through the sadness. He really did think of everything. He tried. Before leaving, I gathered the family ledger, Richard's letter, and the flash drive into my handbag. Oliver stopped me at the office door. One more thing. I turned. Between now and the meeting, don't argue with Ethan or Vanessa. That won't be difficult. If they contact you, listen more than you speak. I raised an eyebrow. Why? Because people often reveal more when they believe they've already won. His advice stayed with me during the drive home. 2 days later, just as Oliver predicted, my phone rang. Vanessa. I almost let it go to voicemail, but answered anyway. Hello, Vanessa. Her tone sounded surprisingly pleasant. Hi, Margaret. I just wanted to check whether you'd had a chance to review the invoice. I have. Wonderful. I know Christmas wasn't the ideal time, but we thought starting the new year with everything settled would be healthiest for everyone. Healthiest? Another carefully chosen word. I've reviewed every page, I replied. Good. She paused before continuing. Do you think you'll be able to make payment before interest begins? I glanced across my living room at the framed photograph of Richard smiling beside the Christmas tree 5 years earlier. Actually, I answered calmly. I've scheduled a meeting after New Year's to discuss the matter. A meeting? There was the slightest crack in her confidence. With whom? People who are familiar with the family's financial history. Silence followed. Not the uncomfortable silence from Christmas dinner. This one felt different. Calculating. Careful. Finally, Vanessa spoke again. I'm sure that won't be necessary. I think it will. Margaret. Her voice softened. There's no reason to make this bigger than it already is. I looked once more at Richard's photograph before answering. I didn't make it bigger, Vanessa. Someone else started keeping score long before I ever knew there was a game. She didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her confidence had almost completely disappeared. Who exactly is going to be at this meeting? I smiled gently, though she couldn't see it. You'll find out soon enough. The conference room at Harrison and Cole overlooked a gray January skyline, dusted with fresh snow. The long walnut table reflected the winter sunlight pouring through the windows, and for a brief moment it reminded me of every holiday meal Richard and I had hosted over the years. Family had always gathered around tables, sometimes to celebrate, sometimes to heal, and occasionally, as I was about to learn, to face the truth. Ethan arrived first. He looked exhausted, the deep circles beneath his eyes making him appear older than his 43 years. He offered me a hesitant smile. Morning, Mom. Good morning, Ethan. We embraced briefly. It felt familiar, yet uncertain, as though neither of us knew where we stood anymore. Vanessa entered a few minutes later carrying a leather portfolio. She greeted everyone politely, but I noticed her eyes immediately searching the room, trying to understand why Oliver had requested this meeting. Oliver waited until everyone had taken a seat before speaking. Thank you for coming. Richard Collins left very specific instructions regarding circumstances that, unfortunately, now require our attention. Vanessa crossed her arms. Is this really necessary? This whole misunderstanding could have been resolved with a conversation. Oliver calmly slid the Christmas invoice into the center of the table. That conversation began the moment this document was presented. No one spoke. Oliver then placed the thick family ledger beside the invoice. The contrast between the two documents was striking. One contained 5 years of carefully calculated household expenses. The other documented decades of quiet generosity. Mrs. Collins, Oliver said, looking toward Vanessa, before we review these records, would you like to explain the purpose of the invoice? Vanessa straightened in her chair. It wasn't meant to be cruel. We simply believed everyone should contribute fairly. Oliver nodded politely. Including a mother who helped finance your education, wedding, home, and countless emergencies? Vanessa hesitated. Those were gifts. Oliver gently opened the ledger. Exactly. He began turning pages one by one. Every canceled check, every tuition payment, every mortgage contribution, every medical expense, every business loan Richard had quietly forgiven. Ethan leaned forward, his expression changing with each page. Dad never told me about most of this. He didn't want you to feel indebted, Oliver replied. He wanted you to build your own life. Ethan slowly covered his mouth with one hand. I had no idea. Oliver continued until the final summary appeared. Total documented financial assistance provided to Ethan and his immediate family over the years exceeded $600,000. No interest, no repayment schedule, no invoices. Only handwritten notes from Richard that simply read, "Family comes first." The room fell silent. Oliver then picked up Vanessa's invoice once more. By comparison, this document assigns charges for shared meals, overnight visits, rides to school events, babysitting requested by your own daughter, and breakfast served the morning after Richard's funeral. Ethan's face turned pale. He looked toward Vanessa. You charged my mother for staying with us after Dad died. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. It wasn't supposed to be taken literally. Ethan stared at the invoice as though seeing it for the first time. You put interest on it. She looked down. I copied the format from. Her voice stopped abruptly. Oliver finished the sentence for her. From Richard's financial records. Vanessa's silence was answer enough. Ethan pushed his chair back and stood. Mom. His voice broke. I'm so sorry. I looked at my son for a long moment. The little boy who used to run into my arms after every scraped knee was still there beneath the disappointment, the silence, and the mistakes. I know you are, I answered softly. Oliver placed one final document on the table, the trust amendment Richard had prepared years before. He explained its provisions carefully. Future discretionary distributions from the Collins Family Trust would be suspended pending an independent review, exactly as Richard had instructed. No accusations. No revenge. Simply accountability based on documented conduct. Vanessa quietly lowered her eyes. For the first time since Christmas dinner, she had nothing to say. I reached into my handbag and removed a cashier's check. It was made out for exactly $18,472. I slid it across the table toward Vanessa. Her eyes widened with visible relief. Before she could reach for it, I placed a single finger on the check. This money isn't because I owe you, I said calmly. I can afford every penny on that invoice. I looked around the room before continuing. I'm leaving this here because I never want anyone to believe money was the issue. It never was. I withdrew my hand, but Ethan gently picked up the check instead of Vanessa. Without saying a word, he tore it cleanly in half, then into quarters, then into tiny pieces that drifted onto the polished conference table like scraps of snow. Tears rolled freely down his face. We're not taking your money, he whispered. We already took far more than we ever deserved. No one moved. No one interrupted the silence. Finally, I stood, gathered Richard's ledger, and smiled at the photograph Oliver had placed beside the documents that morning. Your father gave us more than money, I said to Ethan. He gave us an example. The question now is whether we're willing to follow it. As I walked toward the door, Chloe stepped into the hallway. She had been waiting quietly outside after school. She wrapped her arms around me without saying a word. Sometimes love doesn't need an explanation. It simply chooses not to keep score. Thank you for spending this time with me and following Margaret's journey to the very end. If this story touched your heart, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined me for more stories about family, forgiveness, and the quiet strength that carries us through life's hardest moments. Until next time, take good care of yourself and the people you love.